I'm Marisol Williams. I was 29 years old when my life stalled in place, not because I failed, but because I kept succeeding at the wrong things. At the time, I was an adjunct philosophy professor earning $32,000 a year. I taught 6 classes across 3 colleges, logic at one campus on Mondays and Wednesdays, ethics at another on Tuesdays, contemporary philosophy at a third on Thursdays and Fridays. No office, no benefits, no health insurance. I shared a cramped apartment with 2 roommates because rent didn't care about academic credentials. I biked 14 miles a day between campuses because it was cheaper than owning a car and faster than unreliable buses. This wasn't temporary. This was year 7. I wasn't drifting. I was building toward something specific. My PhD thesis was nearly finished. One defense stood between me and eligibility for tenure-track jobs, the difference between permanent instability and a livable future. Everything I did was structured around that timeline. Teaching paid the bills. Writing happened at night. Sleep was optional. Health was postponed. And despite all of that, I was the responsible one in my family. That part still surprises people when they hear it. Over 7 years, I transferred $190,000 to my younger sister, Kennedy. Not because I was wealthy, not because it was easy, because I was reliable. $80,000 for her NYU undergraduate tuition, $60,000 for grad school, $20,000 in apartment deposits when her leases required proof of stability, $30,000 in emergencies that somehow never stopped being emergencies. I ate ramen and peanut butter. I skipped doctor visits. I ignored dental pain. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family helped family. Kennedy was 25 then. She had 400,000 Instagram followers and called herself a lifestyle influencer. She lived in a Tribeca loft my parents co-signed. She drove a BMW my parents bought. Her brand partnerships earned her $8,000 a month, sometimes more. She talked about freedom and manifestation and knowing your worth. When she posted photos, she used words like aligned and abundant. People believed her. My parents believed her most of all. In our family, success wasn't measured by effort or outcome. It was measured by optics. Kennedy looked successful. I looked unfinished. I had degrees instead of visibility, publications instead of followers. My parents introduced her to friends with pride. They introduced me with explanation. This wasn't an argument we ever had outright. It was quieter than that. It lived in small decisions. In who got asked how they were doing. In who got checked on. In who got told, "You'll figure it out, you always do." I did figure it out, repeatedly. That was the problem. By the time I was 29, I had structured my entire life around making sure nothing collapsed. I didn't panic. I didn't ask for help unless I had no alternative. I made contingency plans for my contingency plans. I kept receipts. I paid things early. I showed up prepared. I did not make scenes. I also didn't complain. That matters because silence gets interpreted as strength, and strength gets exploited. The week everything broke, my calendar was precise. Final revisions due, defense scheduled in 3 days, spring term ending, summer teaching contracts pending. My bank account was balanced down to the dollar. I had exactly enough to make it through the month if nothing went wrong. Something went wrong. I was biking between campuses when the car hit me. Not dramatically, no screeching tires, no cinematic pause, just impact, pavement, and a sudden understanding that I couldn't stand. The pain came later. First was confusion, then the leg that wouldn't respond, then the realization that my helmet had cracked. In the emergency room, time lost its shape. A broken leg, a concussion, imaging, waiting, paperwork. When the doctor explained I needed surgery, I nodded like this was information I could absorb later. When billing came in, they didn't wait. $47,000. I had no insurance. I did the math automatically. What could be deferred? What could be negotiated? What couldn't? Surgery required a deposit, $5,000. Without it, they would delay. Delays meant complications. Complications meant longer recovery. Longer recovery meant missing my thesis defense. Missing the defense meant losing the window. This wasn't abstract. It wasn't philosophical. It was arithmetic. If I missed that defense, 7 years collapsed into nothing. The teaching contracts depended on progress. The job applications depended on completion. The loans depended on income that didn't yet exist. I lay there with my leg immobilized and my mind racing through variables. I had never felt so physically stuck and mentally frantic at the same time. I knew exactly who to call. That knowledge didn't come from entitlement. It came from precedent. From years of being the one who filled gaps. From the assumption, never spoken aloud, that when things mattered, family intervened. I picked up my phone because, logically, this was the moment all of that reliability was supposed to return to me. I didn't yet understand that I was about to learn something precise and irreversible about how my family measured worth. And once learned, it couldn't be unlearned. People assume favoritism is loud, that it shows up as shouting or blatant cruelty. In my family, it was administrative. It lived in logistics, in who got asked for help and who was assumed to be help, in how money moved without discussion, in how my parents spoke about risk as something to avoid for Kennedy and something to endure for me. I didn't wake up one day and decide to sacrifice $190,000. It happened in increments small enough to feel reasonable at the time. The first transfer was when Kennedy got into NYU. She called me crying, happy tears, panicked tears, all tangled together. Financial aid hadn't covered enough. My parents were working things out, which in our family meant stalling. I had just started adjuncting. My savings were thin, but I sent the first $5,000 without hesitation. I told myself it was an investment in her future. That phrase would come back a lot. Then came the next semester, and the next. Tuition gaps, housing deposits, study abroad fees that were supposedly essential for her brand. Each time the amount increased slightly. Each time I recalculated my own life downward. I took extra sections. I delayed replacing my laptop. I switched from groceries to bulk ramen and eggs. I stopped renewing things that expired quietly, gym memberships, dental coverage, preventative care. I told myself this was what being the older sibling meant. What I didn't notice at first was how no one ever asked if I could afford it. The requests came casually. Kennedy would text, "Hey, quick thing, can you spot me?" My parents would frame it as temporary, just until something cleared, just until a partnership paid out, just until she found her footing. Meanwhile, her lifestyle escalated in visible, documented ways. Better apartments, better clothes, better restaurants, better cars. When I pointed this out once, carefully, politely, my mother laughed like I'd misunderstood the question. "That's how you grow a personal brand," she said. "You have to look the part." Apparently, I didn't. By year 3, the transfers were automatic. I didn't need to be asked. I preempted the need. It felt efficient. It felt adult. It felt like preventing emergencies instead of reacting to them. I told myself this was rational behavior. But rationality without boundaries turns into erosion. My parents praised Kennedy's ambition constantly. They used words like savvy and marketable. They told friends she was building something real. When they spoke about me, they used qualifiers. Still finishing, very intellectual, not exactly practical, but brilliant. I learned quickly not to correct them. Every time I approached a milestone, another publication, another course evaluation that exceeded expectations, I waited for the acknowledgement that never quite came. Instead, conversations redirected back to Kennedy's metrics. Follower counts, engagement rates, brand outreach. She had numbers people understood. I had citations. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the framing. When Kennedy needed help, it was an opportunity. When I struggled, it was a consequence. My parents didn't see my sacrifices as generosity. They saw them as proof that I could manage without support. Reliability became my defining trait, and once assigned, it was never rewarded, only relied upon. There were moments I almost said something. Moments when I opened my mouth and closed it again. I didn't want to sound resentful. I didn't want to fracture the family over money. I told myself things would rebalance later, when my degree was finished, when my income stabilized, when everyone could exhale. I believed in delayed equilibrium. What I didn't realize was that my family had already decided where equilibrium lived. And it wasn't centered on fairness. It was centered on return. I found that out much later, but the evidence had been there all along. Kennedy never asked how I was doing. Not really. She asked if I was busy, if I could Venmo, if I'd seen her latest post. When I mentioned being tired, she reframed it as dedication. "That's why you're so impressive," she'd say. "I could never live like that." She never had to. By the time I turned 29, the pattern was so established that it felt structural, like gravity. I didn't expect things to change. I just expected them to continue. That's why the accident didn't feel like a twist at first. It felt like an interruption, something inconvenient but solvable. I had solved worse with less. Lying in that hospital bed, I replayed the years quickly, the way your mind does when it's under threat. I thought about every time I'd said yes, every time I'd covered a gap, every time I'd been told, "You're strong, you'll be fine." Strength, I was learning, had become my liability. I wasn't angry yet. I was still practical, still calm, still assuming reciprocity existed somewhere beneath the surface. I hadn't yet reached the moment where illusion collapses into fact. That moment was coming. And it would arrive not with shouting, not with drama, but with a text message that would make everything painfully, mathematically clear. Pain doesn't announce itself the way people expect. It doesn't rush in with drama. It waits until you understand what you've lost, then it settles in. In the emergency room, I learned that my leg was broken in 2 places. Tibia and fibula. Clean fractures, the doctor said, like that was reassuring. The concussion was mild, which meant I was conscious enough to understand what was being said to me and disoriented enough that it took effort to stay focused. They spoke in efficient sentences. I answered in nods. I kept asking one question, over and over, to anyone who would listen. "How long until I can walk?" They gave me ranges, weeks, months, variables. Surgery would improve outcomes. Delay would complicate recovery. Recovery timelines depended on compliance, rest, physical therapy. All I heard was time slipping. My phone was still in my hand when the nurse finished taping an IV. I'd been gripping it without realizing. I checked my calendar automatically. 3 days. That's how long until my thesis defense. 3 days until the moment my entire professional future hinged on my ability to sit upright and think clearly. I could manage pain. I could manage discomfort. What I couldn't manage was absence. Adjuncts don't get grace periods. Graduate committees don't pause schedules for accidents. The defense date had been negotiated across multiple faculty calendars months in advance. Rescheduling wasn't impossible, but it was risky. Delays sent signals. Signals affected recommendations. Recommendations affected hiring. I knew the chain. I had lived inside it for years. The surgeon came back and explained the procedure. Plates, screws, an overnight stay, standard. Then billing arrived like a separate species entirely. Different tone, different urgency. They needed a deposit. $5,000. Without it, surgery would be postponed until financial arrangements were confirmed. Postponement meant pain management only. It meant waiting. I asked how long. They didn't answer directly. I did the math again, slower this time. My checking account, my savings, what was liquid, what was already allocated. I could maybe scrape together a fraction of it if I emptied everything. That would still leave me short. And even if I managed it, I'd have nothing left for rent, utilities, food. Nothing for the month after. This wasn't about being uncomfortable. It was about falling through a floor I'd spent years reinforcing. I asked to be left alone for a moment. When the curtain closed, the room felt smaller. The sounds of the ER pressed in monitors, footsteps, low voices, a crying child somewhere down the hall. I stared at the ceiling and tried to slow my breathing. I needed to make a decision quickly, but not emotionally. I had options technically. None of them were good. I could apply for emergency financial aid, but approvals weren't immediate. I could delay surgery and risk complications. I could beg friends, but my circle was mostly other adjuncts and grad students, brilliant, broke, already stretched. I could max out a credit card and deal with the consequences later. Or I could do the thing I had avoided doing for years, unless absolutely necessary. I could ask my parents. That decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural. This was the kind of situation families prepared for. Medical emergencies weren't luxuries. They weren't optional. I wasn't asking for comfort. I was asking for functionality. I drafted the message carefully. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I stated facts. I was hit by a car. I have a broken leg and a concussion. I need surgery. I don't have insurance. They need a $5,000 deposit to proceed. My thesis defense is in 3 days. I can't miss it. Can you help me cover the deposit? I'll pay you back once I defend and secure the job. I read it twice before sending. It was concise, reasonable, temporary. I pressed send. Waiting is its own kind of pain. The minutes stretched in a way that made my head throb. I watched the typing indicator appear, disappear, reappear. I told myself not to interpret that. I told myself not to spiral. When the response came, it wasn't delayed. It was immediate. And it was not a question. My father's text was short, clean, final. Marisol, you made your choices. You chose philosophy over business school. Kennedy chose marketable skills. We can't keep bailing out your poor decisions. You're 29. Grow up. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower, as if clarity might change the words. It didn't. There was no mention of the accident, no acknowledgement of the injury, no concern about surgery, no question about my condition, just an assessment, a verdict. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the concussion. This wasn't refusal. This was categorization. In that moment, I understood something with a precision that surprised me. This wasn't about money. $5,000 was insignificant compared to what had already moved through my account on behalf of this family. This was about narrative. In their narrative, Kennedy invested wisely. I gambled foolishly. She was building something real. I was indulging a hobby. Her needs were strategic. Mine were consequences. I felt something shift internally. Not explode, not crack, but realign. A nurse came in to check my vitals and paused when she saw my face. I handed her the phone without speaking. She read the message once, then again. Her jaw tightened. She introduced herself as Janet, social worker, 55, practical eyes, no theatrics. She didn't ask me how I felt. She said, "Honey, those people don't deserve you." Then she sat down and started explaining options I hadn't been told about yet. As she spoke, I realized something else. The illusion I had been operating under, that reliability would be returned when it mattered, had just collapsed. And once an illusion collapses, you don't grieve it. You document it. Because from that moment on, Nothing was going to be assumed. Everything was going to be proven. By the time I realized how deeply I'd been underestimated, my leg was strapped into a temporary cast, and the dull throb in my head reminded me I wasn't thinking entirely straight. But thinking clearly was exactly what I needed to do. I needed a solution. The hospital wouldn't wait. My thesis defense wouldn't wait. My life wouldn't wait. There was one course of action that seemed rational, necessary, and unavoidable. I had to ask for help. From them, my parents. I drafted the message carefully, deleting anything that could be interpreted as emotional manipulation. I had done this before, countless times. Precision was essential. Dad, I need help. Can you cover the hospital deposit so they'll do surgery? $5,000. I'll pay you back when I defend and get the job. Send. Immediately, the typing indicator blinked back. My stomach tightened. Every fiber in my body screamed that the response would define the next 36 hours of my life. The reply arrived. Marisol, you made your choices. You chose philosophy over business school. Kennedy chose marketable skills. We can't keep bailing out your poor decisions. You're 29. Grow up. I read it 3 times, then a 4th, hoping that somehow context or punctuation would soften the blow. It didn't. Every word was calibrated. Every sentence a verdict. No concern for my injury, my hospitalization, my thesis defense, just judgment. The room blurred around me. Machines beeped. Nurses walked past. Yet it all felt distant, irrelevant. There was only the text, and it carried an implication I'd never fully confronted. I wasn't supposed to matter in emergencies. My value was defined by a utilitarian calculus, usefulness, not need. I put the phone down and took a slow, deliberate breath. Anger surged. Resentment flared. But beneath both was something sharper, clarity. This was no longer about helping me. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy that had been in place for years. I was the family's safety net. I was the responsible one. I was the invisible reservoir, and reservoirs are drained without notice. Janet, the social worker, had been observing quietly. She didn't flinch at my father's words. Instead, she leaned in and said, "Honey, those people don't deserve you." Her tone wasn't sentimental. It wasn't comforting, it was factual. Practical, final. She helped me navigate options I hadn't known existed. Hospital financial aid, payment plans, emergency funds available to patients in my exact situation. As she worked, she told me to photograph everything, the texts, the messages, the receipts. "Save everything," she said. "You'll need it later." I listened, but part of me remained detached, cataloging the absurdity of it all. Every transfer I'd made to Kennedy, every compromise, every sacrifice, every unpaid debt of recognition owed to me. It hit me with unrelenting clarity. I had been reliable because I was supposed to be, not because it was reciprocated. Reliability had been a commodity, and commodities are exploited until exhaustion. I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. There was a path forward that didn't involve asking for anyone's permission or approval. There was a path that didn't involve me continuing to subsidize the illusion of success around me. But before I could move forward, I needed evidence, proof, historical records. I remembered the emails, the automatic bank transfers, the subtle messages that hinted at this hierarchy. If I was going to make a rational move, I needed the facts in front of me. Even with Janet guiding me, the emotional weight pressed down like gravity. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was hurt. Not just because of the accident, or the financial barrier, or the absurdity of having to prove my own worth to survive, but because for years, everything I'd done had been invisible. Every contribution, every early payment, every overlooked day spent biking 14 miles between campuses. Invisible. Yet clarity came with the hurt. The same message that should have crushed me also clarified the rules of engagement. Reliability alone was not enough. Being quiet and disciplined was not enough. Emotional labor and sacrifice without acknowledgement could no longer be assumed to carry weight. I could feel the pivot in my chest, the moment where despair transforms into planning, where inertia becomes action, where the narrative, long controlled by others, could be rewritten. I spent the night cataloging the sequence of transfers, noting every emergency that had been quietly resolved at my expense. I began to frame the pattern in a way I could leverage. Numbers, dates, emails, evidence meticulously collected, impossible to ignore. I knew I had crossed an invisible threshold. The next step would be to confront reality in a way I had avoided for 7 years. To act deliberately, not emotionally. To reclaim power quietly, efficiently, ruthlessly if necessary. By morning, the anger had settled into a precise focus. The pattern was clear. The evidence existed. The next move would be deliberate. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't plead. I would act. And that action would change everything. The hierarchy that had ruled my life, financial, emotional, social, was about to be exposed. But I had no idea, yet just how public it would become. The morning after the ER, I woke with my leg throbbing and my mind racing. Pain is an amplifier. It forces clarity. I had been underestimating something I should have cataloged years ago: evidence. The pattern of dependence, the automatic transfers, the invisible labor. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. And if I was going to act, I needed to see it all laid bare. I started with my bank statements. Every transfer to Kennedy, every automatic payment. 47 documented transactions over 7 years. Each one a proof point, a brick in a house built entirely on my labor. I made a spreadsheet, noting amounts, dates, and the stated purpose. Tuition, apartment deposits, emergencies. My eyes traced the numbers as though reading a confession. Then I searched through old emails. Kennedy's requests weren't casual or fleeting, they were methodical. 47 messages explicitly asking for financial support. Each one politely phrased, always urgent, always framed in necessity, never in gratitude. I felt a chill as I realized this pattern wasn't occasional. It was consistent, almost ritualized. I found my parents' group chat next. This was the final proof. Their words were blunt and unguarded, as though they were writing for themselves rather than me. My father had written, "Kennedy's influence business is real income. Marisol's philosophy degree is a hobby. We invest where there's ROI. ROI, return on investment. That was how my contributions had been measured. Numbers, not effort, not sacrifice, not time. I took photos of every email, screenshots of every transfer, the group chat, every receipt from the last 7 years. Janet had been right, save everything. But I hadn't understood the magnitude until I saw it all together. It hit me in waves. Anger, yes, but sharper than anger was the precision of understanding. I hadn't been ignored because my parents were overwhelmed or because life was complicated. I had been ignored because I wasn't profitable. My worth had been assessed like a spreadsheet, and I hadn't made the cut. I leaned back, propped on the hospital pillows, and ran my hands over my face. My body was broken, but my mind was sharpening. Every prior sacrifice suddenly read differently. Every midnight spent revising lectures. Every skipped meal. Every penny I'd saved for emergencies that were not mine but mine to manage. I realized I had been funding a lifestyle, not a family. The implication was overwhelming, but the consequence was simple. The moment of truth had arrived. If I wanted to reclaim agency over my life, I couldn't just react emotionally. I had to act strategically. Evidence was power. Power had been denied me for decades, but now it was mine, tangible and undeniable. I paused to organize the evidence, grouping transactions by category, emails by tone, and parental commentary by implication. It was like reconstructing a timeline of exploitation. Each item confirmed what I already suspected but had been unable to articulate. The generosity I had extended wasn't appreciated. It had been leveraged. It was exhausting to realize that I had been living a life in service of someone else's illusion. But in exhaustion, there was clarity. I could see the leverage points. I could see the weak links. And I could see where intervention would have maximum impact. At the same time, another tension lingered. Evidence alone didn't solve the immediate problem. Surgery still needed the deposit. Thesis defense still waited. My body still ached. And Kennedy, she was about to make her next move in public. Before I tell you what I discovered next, I need to ask, have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to believe in you? Comment, enough, if you know what that feels like. Because what I was about to uncover would make it painfully clear just how long I'd been carrying the weight of other people's success. I dug further into emails from Kennedy around the time she was expanding her social media reach. Requests for funds coincided precisely with big launches, posts, collaborations, event appearances. Each ask was framed as urgent, essential, necessary. Each one cleared by me automatically. No one else questioned it. I realized that over 7 years, I had essentially subsidized her lifestyle entirely. Every brand partnership she claimed to fund herself had been indirectly paid for with my money. Every apartment deposit, every studio rental, every emergency she had conjured, all mine. And yet, publicly, Kennedy's success appeared organic. Her followers, her sponsors, her parents all saw her as independent, entrepreneurial, smart. Not a single one of them knew the foundation was me. Not my effort, not my sacrifice, not my bank balance. I leaned back again, staring at the ceiling tiles above the ER bed. This wasn't about jealousy. This was about reality, about ownership, about finally seeing the pattern for what it was and recognizing the opportunity it created. Opportunity meant leverage. Leverage meant that, for the first time in years, I wasn't powerless. I had documented proof, a clear trajectory, and a moment coming, her public launch in 6 months, where exposure would be inevitable. I pictured the gallery, 300 influencers, press, investors, Kennedy announcing her angel investor parents. I knew then that the illusion she relied on could be dismantled, not for spite, but for clarity, for justice. And there was no turning back. The knowledge was now active, operational. I had the receipts, I had the documentation, and I had the patience to wait for the right moment. I closed my laptop and breathed deeply, letting the weight of what I'd uncovered settle. My body hurt, my leg throbbed, but mentally I had never been sharper. I wasn't asking for recognition anymore. I was preparing to claim it. And when the time came, the impact wouldn't just be personal, it would be public. By the time Kennedy's brand launch loomed on the calendar, I understood something fundamental. The world rewards appearances, not reality. Not effort, not sacrifice, not the invisible labor that sustained her. Applause was reserved for those who looked the part, spoke the part, and curated it with meticulous precision. I watched from behind the scenes, carefully tracking her growth. Social media metrics, follower counts, engagement rates, sponsorship offers, collaborations. Every like, every share, every comment a marker of success in the eyes of the audience. I had built the infrastructure for it all, and the irony was sharp enough to taste. My labor fueled her visibility, yet I remained invisible. It wasn't just her online presence. She had a team now, managers, PR reps, stylists, photographers, all coordinated for a single purpose, to create the illusion of independence, ambition, and accomplishment. And it worked. Friends, acquaintances, casual followers, even investors saw the lifestyle, the growth, the charisma. They didn't see the account statements, the emergency transfers, or the late-night emails where I quietly resolved yet another crisis. I reminded myself, perception is currency. In Kennedy's world, every dollar, every post, every flawless frame contributed to her net worth, not mine. and no one outside the room where transfers occurred had any interest in the truth. The question became strategic: how to expose reality without compromising myself. My leg was healing slowly, still in a cast, but my focus had sharpened. I began planning a map. Each event, each post, each claim she made publicly could be paired with evidence: bank statements, emails, receipts. The chronology was precise: 7 years of documented transactions, mapped directly against her claimed independence. It wasn't anecdotal, it was undeniable. I started anticipating the gallery event. Soho, 6 months away, 300 influencers, press, investors. I could visualize it in advance. The white walls, the curated art, the hum of polite conversation. I imagined her standing in the center of it all, announcing that her parents were her angel investors. My stomach tightened as I realized the absurdity. Every dollar attributed to parental support had in reality been mine. Before the event, I paused to consider the psychological dynamics. How would people react if presented with the unfiltered facts? Would investors leave? Sponsors withdraw? Friends hesitate? And more importantly, would Kennedy understand, truly, that the life she flaunted publicly had been constructed on my sacrifices? It wasn't vengeance that motivated me, it was calibration, clarity, setting the record straight in a system that had rewarded perception over reality for far too long. I needed the impact to be unavoidable. Every day, I reinforced my mental plan. I rehearsed conversations in my head. Not confrontations, but precise statements. Facts only, documented proof, methodical delivery. Emotion would be irrelevant. Evidence would speak louder than any argument. I monitored her social media output, noting timing and content. Every post, every sponsored message, every life update offered a cue. I began archiving screenshots in chronological order. Each digital footprint was a potential tie-in to the larger narrative I was building. By the 3rd month, the tension had become constant. Every moment in public felt like a potential trigger point. Every post I archived became a stepping stone. Every transfer in my spreadsheet, a reminder of the leverage I held. My body still hurt, but my mind had never been more alert. I also recognized a dangerous element. Patience was essential. Acting too soon would waste the advantage I had spent years accumulating. Timing was everything. If I revealed the pattern prematurely, it would be dismissed as spite. But if I waited until the gallery launch, when the public narrative reached its peak, the revelation would resonate. The contrast between her crafted image and documented reality would be undeniable. At night, I ran scenarios through my mind. Journalists recording, influencers streaming, investors evaluating her work. Each scenario included the strategic insertion of evidence. My calculations were precise. I imagined the exact points where I would deliver documents, where I would speak. My role was not to humiliate, but to recalibrate perception, truth over illusion. And yet the tension was relentless. My leg still throbbed. Thesis defense still loomed. Hospital bills were unresolved. Every day I balanced healing with planning, survival with strategy. Every small decision became a test of endurance and mental clarity. Before I move on to what finally happened at the gallery, I need to ask, have you ever seen someone's success rewarded while you did all the work behind the scenes? Comment "seen" if you know that feeling. Because the event I was preparing for would force everyone to confront exactly who had built what. As the launch approached, the stakes crystallized. Kennedy would be in the spotlight, flaunting success. I would be armed with truth. One misstep could derail months of meticulous planning. But executed correctly, the contrast between illusion and reality would be undeniable, public, and irreversible. I also knew this. In moments like these, the universe rewards precision and patience more than anger or impulse. My anger fueled focus, but focus would determine outcome. Every detail mattered. Every record mattered. Every day counted. And finally, as the gallery invitation landed in her inbox, styled, perfect, curated. I allowed myself a brief, quiet satisfaction. I had positioned myself exactly where I needed to be. Kennedy would be in her element, and the world would soon see what her world had cost me. The countdown had begun. The public stage, the apex of her curated success, was just months away. And when it arrived, nothing about the truth could be denied. The night of the launch arrived like a storm, polished and precise. Soho, white walls, minimalist art, 300 people circulating, influencers with cameras slung over shoulders, PR reps hovering like shadows, journalists with pens poised. Everyone had rehearsed their smiles. Kennedy moved through the crowd with a radiant energy, radiant and deliberate, the kind of energy designed to be captured on video and amplified. I was not in the spotlight. I had a cast on my leg, crutches tapping lightly against the polished floor. I stayed near the edge of the room, observing, cataloging. Her parents were there, perfectly coiffed, standing behind her as she explained the details of her lifestyle brand. She held the microphone as if it had been part of her hand since birth. "And thanks to my amazing family," she said, "my parents are angel investors in this new chapter. Their support, $500,000, has made this launch possible." Applause swelled. Cameras flashed. Influencers streamed it live. Investors nodded appreciatively, impressed by what appeared to be family-backed capital. My stomach turned. Every word, every gesture, every applause, it was all a public performance built on money I had provided. And then, like an echo from the past, someone approached. Professor Helena Rostova, 70 now but still commanding. Silver hair pulled back in a bun, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. My grandfather's former colleague, my dissertation chair, and the one person who had consistently seen me as more than a spreadsheet. She looked at me with something like recognition and warning. "Marisol," she said, voice low but firm, "can we speak?" We stepped aside, away from the crowd into a quieter corner. I could hear the hum of music and chatter, but it felt distant, like another world. Professor Rostova opened her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. It was thick, weighty, the kind of envelope that demanded attention before it was opened. "This is from your grandfather," she said. "He died 3 years ago. He left instructions for me to deliver this only when the family revealed their true nature. Tonight qualifies." My heart skipped. Grandfather, my childhood hero, the man whose philosophy lectures had shaped my curiosity, my stubbornness, my drive. I reached for the envelope, hands trembling. Inside, a letter in precise, looping handwriting, and alongside it, legal documents, trust papers, royalties information. I read the first lines aloud, quietly to myself. "Marisol, they will never value what we do. I am leaving you my book royalties trust, $680,000 accumulated. And the lake cabin. Use it to think, to write, to live. Make them irrelevant." Irrelevant. The word felt like a hammer blow. My grandfather had seen through everything, through the hierarchy, through the pattern of exploitation, through the unreciprocated sacrifices. He had recognized me, finally, fully, and had given me something untouchable: freedom. I flipped the envelope over. Trust documents, cabin deeds, exact amounts. The money existed, legally, fully, untouched, for me, and no one else. My chest tightened. This was validation in physical form, a rupture of years' worth of emotional neglect. But it was also a choice. What I did with this evidence, this inheritance, would define the next decade. Professor Rostova's hand rested lightly on mine. "You deserve this," she said. "And the world is about to see what you've built, even if they've never realized it." I nodded, but the weight of the envelope was heavier than the contents. It carried responsibility. It carried proof. It carried potential ruin. The crowd's energy crept back in, distant but undeniable. I thought of Kennedy at the podium, of her parents smiling, of investors nodding. I realized then that exposure could be public, theatrical, irreversible. Before anything else, I had to prepare. The envelope's contents weren't just for me, they were a strategic tool, a weapon of clarity. I would need timing, precision, control. And the evidence of the past 7 years, the transfers, the emails, the parental commentary, now sat alongside this inheritance like a trigger. If deployed correctly, it would recalibrate everything. Yet even with clarity, I felt the ache of uncertainty. My leg throbbed. My defense loomed. Public scrutiny waited. The moment of revelation was close, but execution was not guaranteed. How would Kennedy react? Would the investors abandon her or dismiss the truth? Would my parents finally understand, or would they double down on denial? Professor Ristova's eyes met mine. Do not act hastily. Wait for the moment that cannot be ignored. I knew she was right. Every instinct screamed for confrontation. Every fiber of my being wanted to act immediately, to make the family, and the world, see the truth of what they had ignored. But timing would determine whether the revelation became transformation or spectacle. And so I waited. I closed the envelope, slipped it under my jacket. It felt alive against my chest. The information, the inheritance, the proof, it pulsed with potential energy. And the room continued around us, oblivious. Kennedy smiled, posed for cameras, recited her lines about investment, ambition, independence. I felt the first real rupture between perception and reality, between illusion and documented truth. The tension coiled in me, a slow-burning force, waiting for release. Before the night ended, I had to ask myself, how public should it become? How far could I push without losing control? Could the revelation destroy everything, or would it finally deliver justice? And the scariest thought settled in. Even with all the evidence, all the inheritance, all the planning, there was no certainty. No certainty about how Kennedy would react. No certainty about my parents' next move. No certainty about the ripple effects across every investor, sponsor, or journalist watching her brand. I left the corner, envelope secure, mind racing. The gala continued around me, gleaming and oblivious. My grandfather's letter had changed everything, and yet nothing was resolved. The night stretched endlessly ahead, a tightrope between revelation and disaster. I was holding proof of 7 years of invisible labor, a fortune in royalties, and a cabin on the lake, everything my family had refused to recognize. But I also held uncertainty, palpable, suffocating, unavoidable. The stage was set. The players were in place. And the story of who had built what, who had sacrificed what, and who would ultimately hold power, was about to be rewritten. But how, and with what consequences, was still unknown. The gallery buzzed like an electric wire strung too tight. Cameras clicked, glasses clinked, people moved with the energy of performance rather than celebration. Kennedy was in the center, radiant, microphone in hand, narrating her journey, her vision, her independence. Every syllable was polished, every gesture rehearsed, every smile calculated. The audience saw a self-made entrepreneur. She didn't see me sitting near the edge, holding the evidence that had fueled every one of her steps. I had rehearsed this night 1,000 times in my head. Each spreadsheet, each email, each bank transfer lined up like dominoes. Timing was everything. Strike too early and it looked like spite. Strike too late and the moment would pass. I wasn't here for spectacle. I was here for truth. I waited until her thank you to her parents landed in the air. $500,000 in investment, she said. Applause. Cameras flashing. Social media streaming. Investors nodding. The weight of the envelope pressed against my chest. Inside were not just my grandfather's instructions, but every documented payment I had made to sustain her life for 7 years. I stepped forward, crutches tapping lightly on the polished floor, careful, deliberate. The murmurs around me shifted, curiosity, surprise. People noticed a woman approaching with purpose. I didn't hesitate. I held the envelope visibly as if it contained evidence of a crime. Professor Ristova followed silently, her presence steady, authoritative. She had advised me to wait for the precise moment, and I had. This was it. I raised my hand. The chatter dimmed slightly. Kennedy froze mid-sentence, her smile faltering just enough to reveal tension. "I'd like to say something," I began, voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline. "About the launch, about the investments, about who built what you're seeing tonight." All eyes shifted, phones lifted, cameras angled, influencers whispered. The room contracted around me, every second stretched, waited. I opened the envelope. Pulling out the letter first, I read aloud, deliberate, letting each word land. "Marisol, they will never value what we do. I am leaving you my book royalties trust, $680,000 accumulated. And the lake cabin. Use it to think, to write, to live. Make them irrelevant." A silence fell. The clinking of glasses paused. Kennedy's parents stiffened, her father's hand tightening on the arm of his partner. Then I pulled out spreadsheets, screenshots, emails, screenshots of the parental group chat, every transfer documented, every request accounted for. I laid them on the nearest table so the room could see. Here are the numbers: 47 transfers over 7 years. Every tuition payment, every apartment deposit, every so-called emergency, all funded by me. Kennedy's angel investors, her parents, haven't invested a cent. Everything you're seeing tonight, every loft, every collaboration, every post, you're welcome to trace it back to me. Cameras clicked, whispers escalated. Influencers streamed live, narrating the drama. Journalists leaned in, pens poised. Phones recorded. Kennedy's eyes narrowed, lips pressing into a line she couldn't control. Her parents shifted, their curated composure cracking. "Marisol," Kennedy said finally, voice tight, almost accusatory. What are you doing?" "I'm showing the truth," I said. "For 7 years, I supported your life. I sacrificed my own. And while I was keeping everything afloat, you presented this life as independently earned. That's not truth. That's an illusion." The room reacted. PR reps murmured to one another, investors whispered, journalists began scribbling furiously. Kennedy's brand partner stepped out, shaking his head, muttering something about authenticity issues. A leading investor, eyes wide, excused himself. Her parents tried to interject. "Marisol, that's not fair." "Fair," I interrupted, voice cutting through the murmurs. "Fair would have been acknowledgement. Fair would have been gratitude. Fair would have been seeing me, the person who literally made this possible." I could see the influence of social media metrics start to collapse in real time. Phones recorded, feeds streamed. Comments, likes, and shares were already exploding. This was viral before it had even left the room. Kennedy's face shifted, shock, panic, disbelief, and then something darker, desperation. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She was performing for the cameras, yes, but now the script had been rewritten without her consent. My grandfather's letter, the trust, the cabin, the spreadsheets, they were evidence and empowerment combined. I was no longer pleading for recognition. I was delivering it on my terms. The room's reaction fractured her carefully curated narrative. Influencers whispered, some recording, some narrating to their followers. "Wait, her sister funded everything? This is insane." PR reps exchanged urgent texts. Investors recalibrated in real time. Her mother began to cry quietly into her champagne flute, realizing the truth that had been right in front of them, but invisible. Kennedy's father looked stricken, a rare vulnerability in his otherwise polished demeanor. I paused, letting it sink in. The audience understood the juxtaposition. The polished launch versus the years of unseen labor, the curated narrative versus documented reality. The emotional tension was almost unbearable. Then I added the final layer. And if anyone doubts the authenticity of this story, my grandfather's trust documents confirm my independence. This is not just exposure. It's inheritance, validation, and proof that what matters cannot always be measured by followers, likes, or appearances. A murmur rippled through the room. Phones clicked. People leaned forward. The event that Kennedy had carefully orchestrated, meant to showcase her influence and independence, had become a stage for the reversal of perception. And yet, even as the tension peaked, uncertainty lingered. Kennedy hadn't spoken. Would she fight, scream, plead, or retreat? Would her parents retaliate legally, emotionally, socially? How far would the ripple effects extend across her brand, her deals, her followers? The room's attention was fixed on her, and she was frozen, staring at the documents, at me, at the realization that her empire had been built on another person's labor, and that person had arrived in the middle of her spotlight to reveal it. The night was far from over. The fallout, immediate and unpredictable, hung in the air like storm clouds. Every influencer's live stream, every journalist's note, every investor's whispered judgment could change the trajectory in an instant. I took a slow breath. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of control and the exhilarating uncertainty of consequence. Nothing was guaranteed. Everything was at stake. And Kennedy had no script to follow. The gallery cleared slowly, but the energy didn't dissipate. Social media feeds were already aflame. Clips of my confrontation had gone live before the last champagne glass was emptied. Influencers uploaded, captioned, and tagged. Comments poured in, polarizing instantly. Finally, someone shows the truth. Versus, how dare she humiliate her sister? The story spread like wildfire, outside the room, across cities, time zones, and platforms. Kennedy sat in stunned silence, the carefully constructed persona shattered. The luxury loft, the partnerships, the curated posts, all now framed under a new lens, everything was funded by me. Her followers, many of whom had admired her independence, now questioned it. Her angel investors, fiction, her empire, built on someone else's labor. Her PR team scrambled. Phones rang, messages pinged. One representative walked out mid-event, shaking their head. Investors whispered urgently. Journalists circled, pens moving faster than the mind could process. The illusion of control had evaporated, leaving raw vulnerability exposed in front of everyone. Her parents tried damage control. Her mother, red-faced, murmured apologies, grasping for composure, while her father sputtered explanations that rang hollow. Years of framing me as irresponsible and her as savvy had crumbled in a single public moment. Their carefully maintained narrative no longer applied. I watched from the sidelines, crutches steady, voice calm. I didn't shout, didn't accuse further. The evidence spoke louder than any words I could add. The spreadsheets, screenshots, emails, trust documents, they were irrefutable. The truth carried its own authority. Kennedy's eyes found me finally, wide with disbelief, a mixture of anger, panic, and something else, recognition. She understood in that instant the enormity of what I had sustained for her. The life she had flaunted, the narrative she had curated, all traced back to my unseen labor. The immediate consequences were swift. Brand deals collapsed. A major sponsor canceled, citing authenticity concerns. The investor who had flown in for the launch quietly left the room, muttering about reevaluating future commitments. Journalists scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines about familial exploitation and the cost of influence. Kennedy's social media followers began to drop, some accusing her of deceit, others sympathizing. But the metrics were irreversible. Her following plummeted from 400,000 to 100,000 within days. The loft, gone. The apartment she had rented in Tribeca, co-signed by our parents, could no longer be sustained. She moved to Queens, her public status diminished, the aura of independence she had cultivated evaporating overnight. Meanwhile, I began to see the personal restoration unfold. The envelope from my grandfather remained in my possession, a tangible reminder that the world could recognize the value of intellect, effort, and unseen labor. The $680,000 trust, the lake cabin, the royalties, they were not just material, they were symbolic. A validation of every hour, every sacrifice, every mile I had biked between campuses while she thrived off the benefits. I used some of the inheritance to stabilize my life, medical bills, rent, and essentials. But I also invested in the cabin, a space where I could think, write, and live on my terms. My dissertation, paused for months due to the accident, resumed. Within 6 months, I defended successfully and received a tenure-track offer at Cornell. The academic world finally recognized my work. The fruits of my labor had value that couldn't be measured in likes or followers. Kennedy texted months later, "I'm waitressing. For the first time, I'm earning my own money. It feels real. I'm sorry I took yours." I replied, measured but compassionate, "Keep going. When you've worked a year, we'll talk." Her message revealed the first hint of accountability, though not without the sting of consequence. She was facing the reality of independence without inherited wealth, without parental cosigns, without my invisible labor propping up her life. The social, financial, and emotional collapse had lessons embedded, but she would have to internalize them through experience, not convenience. Even my parents, who had once dismissed my efforts, began visiting the cabin. Awkward attempts at reconciliation were made. They apologized, finally, but I didn't rush forgiveness. Actions mattered more than words. Show me, I thought. They were learning that consequences were real, not theoretical. The fallout wasn't just personal. The narrative of public exposure altered the perception of influence culture itself. Discussions erupted online about the realities behind curated lifestyles. Other content creators questioned transparency. Investors began scrutinizing family-backed ventures more rigorously. My story became a cautionary tale about labor, recognition, and the cost of appearances. Yet despite the tangible victories, uncertainty lingered. Kennedy was still young, learning, and capable of missteps. My parents could revert, resent, or undermine. The public attention was volatile, fluctuating between sympathy, admiration, and outrage, and the academic and financial worlds were not immune to scrutiny. Every step forward required careful balance. The rupture had occurred, the consequences were real, and the restoration of justice had begun. But life, as it always does, remained uncertain. The victories were tangible but fragile, the lessons hard-earned, and the future, despite planning and evidence, remained unwritten. In the aftermath, I finally allowed myself a brief, quiet satisfaction. The truth had been revealed. Recognition had been restored. My life, painstakingly rebuilt, was finally mine. But even with all the leverage, all the inheritance, all the proof, the echo of uncertainty reminded me. Influence and perception may shift, but human behavior is unpredictable, and the next chapter could always surprise. I took a deep breath, letting the tension ease slightly. The story had turned. The scales had rebalanced, though imperfectly. And yet, even in triumph, the room for doubt, for challenge, for unexpected complication remained wide open. The path forward was mine to define, but only if I remained vigilant, strategic, and unflinching. A year had passed since the gallery. A year of recalibration, quiet victories, and slow, deliberate rebuilding. The echo of that night, the confrontation, the evidence, the collapse of carefully curated illusions, still lingered in my mind like a shadow that refused to fade. But shadows can teach you where the light should fall, and in my case, it had illuminated every corner of my life I had once ignored. The cabin on the lake had become my sanctuary. Pine-scented air, the gentle lapping of water against the dock, and a small desk where sunlight hit just right. Here I wrote, not for recognition, not for approval, but because the work itself had value. My dissertation had become a book. My grandfather's trust had provided not just financial freedom, but the affirmation that my labor, my intellect, and my moral compass mattered. I had finished the dissertation, defended it with precision, and secured a tenure-track position at Cornell. Recognition, finally. A future I had built entirely on my own terms. No more invisible labor, no more silent sacrifices, no more living in the shadow of someone else's success. Kennedy had rebuilt her life in Queens. The Tribeca loft was gone. Brand deals that once seemed permanent had evaporated. Her Instagram following was now 100,000, less than a third of what it had been. But there was a difference in the numbers now. This following reflected her authentic work, not a curated illusion built on my sacrifices. She had called me a few months ago, voice tentative, almost hesitant. "I'm waitressing. For the first time, I'm earning my own money. It feels real. I'm sorry I took yours." I remembered the exhaustion of those early mornings in college, the endless biking, the ramen, the self-denial that had funded her life. I didn't respond with anger. I responded with restraint, measured and deliberate. "Keep going. When you've worked a year, we'll talk." She had laughed nervously, a sound I hadn't heard in years, and hung up. That year became her crucible, and I could already see subtle shifts, responsibility, humility, and the first sparks of independent agency. Even my parents had begun to change. Awkward visits to the cabin, tentative attempts at conversation, apologies that were genuine, albeit overdue. Words had replaced silence, but I remained careful. Actions, not words, mattered now. Their re-entry into my life would be conditional, tested, measured, not assumed. Socially, professionally, and personally, my life had transformed. I had autonomy, recognition, and a tangible sense of justice, not revenge, but equilibrium. I was no longer the invisible benefactor or the expendable sibling. I had reclaimed my narrative, and with it, my dignity. Yet, even in this earned peace, a lingering question remained. Kennedy had apologized, but could she truly understand the full cost of her lifestyle? Could she internalize the years of unseen labor and emotional sacrifice? My grandfather had seen it. I had documented it. But would she? This uncertainty wasn't anxiety. It was the residue of responsibility. My role had shifted from provider to observer, and in some ways, mentor. But how far she would go now, armed with experience and accountability, was still unknown. That question hovered like a soft hum at the edges of my calm. I walked along the lake one morning, the frost sparkling along the edges of the dock, the air crisp with winter's edge. My notebook was open in my hand. Ideas, observations, unfinished drafts. Every word felt weighty, deliberate. Every page, a reminder that freedom carries responsibility. The cabin, the royalties, the trust, they weren't just compensation. They were permission. Permission to think. Permission to create. Permission to live fully without obligation to props, illusions, or invisible debts. And yet, with every permission comes choice. How to wield it, how to define its boundaries, how to ensure that past mistakes, mine or others, do not dictate the future. I paused to look at the lake, reflection rippling with the wind. For a moment, it felt like everything had been restored. Justice had been served, the invisible labor finally recognized, the illusions of influence dismantled. My life, finally, was mine. And yet, just beyond that calm, I felt the pulse of possibility. The world is rarely fully quiet after upheaval. Kennedy, my parents, even the larger social ecosystem of influence and perception, all still moved unpredictably. There were stories yet to be written, lessons yet to be internalized, consequences yet to be realized. I allowed myself a smile, not of triumph, but of awareness. Life doesn't end neatly. Even when justice is restored and transformation achieved, uncertainty remains. That lingering question, the one about understanding, responsibility, and growth, hovered in the periphery, a subtle neural loop, not a cliffhanger, but a door left ajar. I returned to my desk. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating pages waiting to be written. My grandfather's words echoed softly in my mind. Make them irrelevant. I thought of the past, the sacrifices, the betrayals, the victories, and I realized relevance is not given, it's claimed. And sometimes claiming it requires both patience and precision. As I began to write, my thoughts flowed freely. The weight of 7 years lifted, replaced by clarity, purpose, and a quiet, hard-earned satisfaction. Yet the question remained, subtle but persistent. Would those I had exposed, Kennedy, my parents, the people who had witnessed it all, truly understand, or would some part of this story continue to play out, in their lives, in mine, in ways I could not yet see? The day stretched forward, calm but alive with potential. The storm had passed. The wreckage had been surveyed. The reconstruction was underway. And I finally had a seat at the table, not just as observer, not just as survivor, but as the architect of my own life. The narrative felt complete, the arc resolved. Justice and transformation had been earned. The world, momentarily, was balanced. But the hum of uncertainty lingered. The story wasn't over, not in the broader sense of influence, of choice, of human behavior. It had simply reached a point of equilibrium, a hard-won pause before the next chapter of life, of growth, and perhaps of reconciliation. And that, I realized, was a rare and extraordinary freedom. To know you have reclaimed your life, yet still allow the world around you to remain unpredictable, to allow for growth, and to leave a door open for the next story to unfold. The storm had passed, yes, but the wind still whispered through the trees along the lake, and in that whisper I heard possibility. I picked up my pen. The page awaited. My story was mine to write.